stood for victory, and that confuses many Americans, still does today, and it certainly did back in the 1950s. In hindsight, though, Korea was not the aberration. Korea was not the aberration. This is just a simple bullet listing of some of the main American conflicts since the founding of the Republic. And if you notice, the vast majority of them are not what we would call the big wars, the World War I and II, the War for Independence, the Civil War. Nor were they even, if you will, the mid-intensity wars like Korea, Vietnam. They were police actions, conflicts, take your pick which, but the low-intensity sorts of things. Okay? Most recently, we have Northern Watch, which is still ongoing over Iraq, and we have Kosovo. Those would not, by any stretch of the imagination, be the big wars like World War I or II, nor would they even be in Korea. So, in hindsight, Korea was not an aberration. It was pretty much normal. This is what the Army's current doctrine operations manual calls limited conflicts. Okay? The spectrum of conflict. And to go through all this, Korea was a war. President Clinton just recently mentioned that in the ceremony in Washington the other day. Previously it had been called a conflict. Well, not really. It was a war. Okay? Now there are scaled down versions of that, which we would call conflicts, raids, peace enforcement operations, support to insurgency, peacekeeping operations, non-combatant emergency evacuation operations, and then all the various things we do during peacetime. So Korea was not a conflict, it was a war. And in the scheme of things, it was a war consistent with pretty much the American tradition of mid-intensity, maybe not for national survival, but it certainly was there. I want to define something before I get too far into this, because obviously words can mean whatever you choose them to mean. What I'm going to be looking at in the sense of limited war is going to be conflict between nation states, primarily, with constraints upon one or more of the following terms or areas. These five over on the left: your objective, your geography, technology, resources, and time. There are additional factors which can influence the conduct of the war, limiting it in various fashions. And those are some of the ones over on the right, such as public opinion, global communications, global economy, fear of retaliation, and enlightened self-interest. Okay? Korea shows this quite clearly in the conflict from the early days up until its termination in '53. I also want to touch on at the very end one area that's not covered in this, and that is the issue of insurgencies, the internal conflicts, because those, although they're not within nation states, they do affect limitations in warfare, and Korea does show us a little bit in that regard as well. I'm not going to touch on nuclear conflict. Now, on these five big areas up here, the five main limitations, the most important is the objective. Okay? The objective is what you're trying to accomplish. It's going to drive the train. Now, there can be a problem with this. All too often, the government, which is, if you will, starting the war, is going to underestimate what it's going to take to achieve this. Okay? Those costs, in making its cost-benefits balance, its decision as to, is this objective worthwhile? In underestimating it, they can then cause escalation. You have to have a very firm decision as to what your objective is, what you are trying to accomplish. Now, just because you started with a limited objective does not mean the war is going to stay so limited, because the other party has to likewise agree to limit it. You go for limitation and the other party does not, pretty shortly your both objectives are both going to be fairly extreme. So there has to be either implicit or tacit, explicit agreement between both parties as to what it is that this war is over. Korea, in fact, turned out to be that. The United Nations did push for limited objectives. There was a little discrepancy, shall we say, between Truman and MacArthur as to what the proper objective was, and that got resolved in fairly short order. But once you start, you have to keep that objective all the way through. When you get into coalition warfare, that objective becomes even more difficult to establish and more difficult to adhere to. Having an objective that coalition members can all agree upon at the start and then are willing to stick with becomes extremely important. We saw, for example, in Desert Storm in the early 90s, how the Allied coalition had to agree on what it was they were accomplishing. They all agreed that they were going to drive the Iraqis out of Kuwait. Whether or not they were going to go any further than that became a subject for debate and discussion within the coalition, and ultimately they had to satisfy themselves with the initial objective of getting Iraq out of Kuwait, as opposed to the overthrow of the Iraqi government. Arab governments could agree on the first part, they could not agree in helping the United States overthrow a fellow Arab government. Similar problems on objectives have faced the United States, most recently in the Kosovo campaign, where the Allied air campaign has had to come to some lowest common denominators to achieve these. So objective is the most important thing that the Korean War can show us. The United Nations Command in Korea did in fact set a reasonable objective early on and was able to adhere to it, and the coalition partners, even though they didn't have the same amount of input as the United States did, adhered to it as well. Second limitation is geography. Now, generally this is going to be an understanding to restrict the shooting to a specific region. Korea is easy, it's a peninsula, and by virtue of its location, off the main trade routes, except for the little western part of Japan. So Korea, they were able to limit fighting geographically, and none of the big parties, Moscow, Beijing, or Washington, was really looking for that conflict to spill outside the narrow confines of that peninsula. The United States, of course, did have the pressure internally to try to expand the bombing, hitting the air bases in Manchuria. They didn't seem to regard that as being a problem with expanding the conflict, although by the same token, the communist side was willing to not strike the American bases in Japan, which by their token would be sanctuaries as well. To a certain extent, that was because of the communist incapacity to do so. We had air superiority or air supremacy towards the end, and that kept them from being able to do that, as well as their limitations in the air power to make the strikes. But limitation on geography is going to be the second major factor. Third major point up there is technology. Now, technology is fairly easy to measure and to try to establish restraints on, even if the restraints are not going to be adhered to. In the early days of this century, we had the Hague Conventions, the Geneva Conventions, trying to limit the uncivilized sorts of weapons, poison gases, dum-dum bullets, things of that sort, and to establish certain rules upon what you could or could not do. The Washington Naval Conference, 1921, tried to establish rules, limitations on tonnage, thereby precluding an arm race. In fact, it did just about the opposite as the Japanese ignored it, and then people shifted from capital ships towards aircraft carriers because they weren't covered by the treaties. Chemical weapons from the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 through 88, also showed ignorance of such, or willingness to ignore such limitations. Iraq had signed protocols banning the use of chemical weapons. They promptly ignored them when it became in their national interest to do so. So if human history is constant, it shows us that limitations on technology are going to be adhered to only in so long as it is in the country's best interest to do so, that national survival takes precedence over these things. Resources are a fourth limitation. Governments are going to establish what sort of resources they're going to put into their war. These limitations, self-imposed, are going to reflect the state's consideration of its own capabilities and needs, as well as what it thinks it's going to take to win. These estimates are usually much too low. We saw in Korea that for the most part it was fought with leftovers from World War II. The industrial capability that it generated, the weapons, the ammunition, the logistics base for World War II had created vast stockpiles, which we then used, at least in the early stages of the war. There were new weapons, new developments as the war went along, such as upgrading from a 2.36-inch bazooka to 3.5, a few more advanced aircraft coming along. But for the most part, Korea was fought with existing resources. That trend is going to remain constant, I think, into the next 50 years. The wars are going to break out, and people are going to be fighting them with what they already have on hand and in stockpile, or what they can buy on the open markets as currently existing weapons, not as brand new ones. Okay? As the weapons are becoming more expensive as well, that's going to be a limitation on the use of these resources, simply because if you've got a $1 billion aircraft carrier with several $100 million worth of aircraft on board, your willingness to risk that casualty becomes much less. You got to think about the cost of losing that versus what you're hoping to gain. Okay? Fifth constant limitation is time. Okay? Now, time is a rather nebulous concept. What we're looking at here is a sense of how long the government thinks it's going to take to achieve its war objectives. This is going to matter more in areas in countries where public opinion really matters. Okay? The United States has a problem in this regard. We can see that there are past examples of this. The British, going into the Falklands, had to achieve a victory fairly early on, according to Margaret Thatcher's decisions. Therefore, they attacked down at the Goose Green airfield, even though that was not really necessary for the conduct of the overall campaign. We had the Battle of Khafji and Desert Storm. Fortunately, the Iraqis initiated it, we finished it. But again, the early victory is pushing on for a quick decision. George Marshall once observed that no democracy can fight a 7 years war. He's probably right. However, you look at the Vietnamese in their most recent conflicts, and they fought their war of independence for essentially 30 years, from the end of World War II up until the final conquest of Saigon in 1975. So time is a matter of what the government is willing to accept for its people, how long they're willing to fight. Most democracies, again, cannot accept a 30 years war. Therefore, time becomes a limitation. Now, those are theoretical limitations. You can go into Clausewitz and find more discussion on those. There are several practical limitations as well. First of those, for lack of a better term, is the CNN factor, the public opinion piece. What will the people stand for? Okay. Closely connected with that is the pervasiveness of the global communications network. It used to be that information traveled through fairly restricted circles. Embassies sent back reports, the various communications links from overseas areas back to the home stations were pretty much government controlled, or if not government controlled, so expensive as to limit the amount of material that can be going through them. That is not the case anymore. With the pervasiveness of the global communication network and its ability to influence public opinion, what is happening overseas can be seen almost real time back home in a fairly unfiltered version. Governments have to consider that as well in making their decisions, either for war or in the conduct of wars. Most recently, for example, in the Russian campaign in Chechnya, the Chechen rebels were able to do video footage, photos, and put them up on websites just about as fast as Moscow, but in many cases even before Moscow, and thereby influence the spin, the interpretation that other countries might be giving the conflict inside of that breakaway republic. An additional factor related to this pervasiveness, both the speed and the pervasiveness of it, is the fact that because of this speed and this pervasiveness, formerly tactical events can now start assuming strategic significance. By that, little small events that previously would have been overseen or ignored now take on front-page significance. For example, several months ago, 3 U.S. Army soldiers were captured by Serbian Special Forces units. That then became front-page news. It became the focus of various diplomatic efforts. Previously, who would have really gotten excited about 3 soldiers being snatched? But because it's now on the front page, because it's happened, governments have to be seen as doing something. Therefore, that can become a limiting factor in terms of what the government can do. Third additional factor is that of the global economy. Global capital used to move fairly slowly. It was the big picture sort of thing. Now, being all wired, it can move extremely rapidly. And although war might be good business for some people, the arms merchants, a few people who can profit by others' misfortune, in general, capital dislikes instability and power struggles. Therefore, it flees. So if you are very slick, you can manage to manipulate somebody else's economy, either by threat, intimidation, or action, and thereby cause economic significant effects. For example, look at Beijing's recent threats about Taiwan prior to the recent Taiwanese presidential elections this past fall. It caused a drop of about 20% in the Taipei stock exchange value. Now, since then it's come back, but if you coordinate all your actions to do an economic consideration as well as diplomatic military, you can have genuine effects. That becomes a limiting factor as well because capital flows freely, much faster than governments can regulate it. Fear of retaliation is probably the single biggest practical limitation on warfare, the fact that the other guy might do something equally bad back to me. World War II, Hitler held off from using biological weapons and chemicals because he thought the Allies would be able to do so. There was an interesting paper about 10 years ago by Barton Bernstein on America's biological warfare program in the Second World War. Well, we know that the Japanese did biological warfare against the Chinese because the Chinese had no capability to retaliate. Hitler didn't use chemicals on Britain because he thought Britain was going to use its bombers to drop chemicals on him should he start things. Same thing applies here. If the party thinks that they can use it and get away with it, it becomes a powerful incentive to do so. Okay? Now, all these limitations are generally, at least the fear of retaliation, generally comes back to the point of people using enlightened self-interest to limit themselves. That's a matter of the stronger limiting itself when they had the capability but not choosing to use it for whatever reason, in large part because it may set a bad precedent that they don't want to use against themselves in the future. So all told then, between the 5 theoretical and these 5 main additional factors, there are a number of limitations that are going to continue to affect war. Most of them started during centuries past. They showed themselves during the Korean War, and they are going to continue to be present for the next 50 years beyond that. Now, I've talked briefly about limited war, focusing primarily on nation states. I want to touch briefly on insurgencies and civil wars. That is a slightly different case. Many of these same limiting factors will still apply, but in slightly different forms. Okay? In the aftermath of World War II, and with the beginning of the Korean War at that same time, there was a beginning of a rash of, if you will, wars of national liberation, wars of independence, as the European colonial empires broke up. Now, in those regards, objectives for the colonies were independence. For the nation-state holding them, it was retention of that colony. These two objectives generally did not permit much of a compromise, and so in many cases, these wars pushed in themselves to a fairly ugly conclusion during the 1960s or even 1970s, simply because there was not a diplomatic solution readily available between the two parties' objectives of either complete independence or continued colonial occupation. Now, insurgencies are using the use of low-level protracted violence to overthrow a political system or force some sort of fundamental change in the political or economic status quo. That bit about a zero-sum solution has traditionally been the case, but recently we've seen the United Nations start taking a more activist role in involvement in internal conflicts. Perception being that they can somehow achieve, by its supranational claim to authority, a position of being able to mediate or at least establish some form of solution. That may continue to be the case. I don't think they're going to see any real tangible solutions simply because the points that lead the two parties in these internal conflicts and insurgencies to try to kill each other are not going to go away just because a UN mediator shows up and tries to establish peace. Those root causes of distrust and hatred are still going to be there. Now, what does all this mean for the future out for the next 20, 30 years or so, at least, if not out to the next 50? As we see weapons of mass destruction continuing to spread, particularly chemical weapons, I think, ballistic missile technology spreading as a means of delivery, the increased ease of getting accurate targeting information by use of satellites and internet resources, I think we're going to see that limited war is going to continue to remain the dominant form of warfare. Korea was the first of the modern wars, if you will, limited, and they're going to continue in that vein. There will be continued conflict, but it's going to be, as the current phrase calls it, asymmetric. Not necessarily army on army or open conflict state on state, but the subversion, the terrorism, the various forms of either computer or economic sabotage. States are going to remain the key players. There will be a lot of other players that are going to be trying to be involved in this, but they just do not have the resources that a nation state can bring into the conflict should it choose to do so. With all that, then, I see that Korea was the first of the modern wars. It was not an aberration. It was in the correct vein, the dominant vein of the American military tradition. And from that, of these limited factors here, Korea shows most of them and will continue to be following in suit.